Chapter 19 of Across the Andes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by James T. Oligny. Across the Andes by Charles Johnson Post. The Indian Uprising. It was in the cold dusk of the high altitude, and tingling with the chill winds that blew from Mount Sarata when we clattered through the streets of Achicachi. Little crystals of ice were already forming in the stagnant pools, and little flurries of snow stung as it whistled through the dull streets of this ancient town. On the edge of Lake Titicaca, this ancient town of Achicachi is the home of petty smugglers who can run their contraband in the native straw boats across from the Peruvian shores. The remains of the old mud wall that surrounded it in the days of the Incas are still fairly preserved in places, and its population is still practically Aymara, with only a sprinkling of half-breed cholos. On fiesta days, the little police are held in their barracks on the big open plaza and sally forth only in parties. The Aymaras gather in great numbers from a score of tribal divisions and unite in the typical drunken dances and festivities. Factions forget and renew old differences, and toward evening little battles break out in the streets or the plaza. The streets are unsafe, and the few white Bolivians and bettered cholos stay within. Always there is the danger of an Indian uprising, and that occasionally takes form. Between times in the fiestas, the Aymaras are handled without regard. At the first word, or less, they are clubbed and for but little more, shot. The dusk of fiesta is filled with drunken, sullen Indians, among whom wander here and there disheveled creatures with clotted wounds. Occasionally the sullen buzz rises, a little restless movement begins from some section of the big plaza, and in a moment a knot of Bolivian police are plunging in to come back with bloody carbine butts. Always there's the dull hatred of the Bolivian by the Aymara, which comes easily to the surface at these times, and there is not a Bolivian statute governing the sale of liquor to an Aymara. If he gets dangerous when drunk, beat him. If too dangerous, kill him. In the hotel in Achicachi, the rooms are windowless and range around the four sides of the patio. You furnish your own bed and bedding, and each holds a heavy log with which to bar the door. In the patio and in and out of the open rooms, some native razorback hogs wandered at their will, and off on one side, more exclusive, was a friendly peccary who would sidle up and grunt sociably in return for a little back-scratching. Over by one of the rooms and tied outside was the queerest animal. From across the patio it looked like a very small bear with heavy, long fur, yet with queer, indefinable difference that explained itself when a closer approach developed a monkey. He was a capuchin, the most friendly and delightful of the monkey tribe, and here he was, miles from his warm tropical home, cheerfully chattering by the side of a tin can that was already filled with ice and sticking out his pink tongue to lick off the flakes of snow that gathered on his fur, a fur that had grown to enormous length and thickness, and left him peering with a brown, quizzical face out from it like a shriveled winter-clad chauffeur or some stockbroker's queen. The next evening we arrived in Sarata, and from there on the difficulties began to pile themselves one on the other. A big, abrupt, and surly egotist had been carefully chosen by some board of directors back in the States to manage a rubber proposition. In a frontier country like that, everyone depends for countless things on neighbors, though neighbors may mean separations that measure hundreds of miles. Yet this gentleman had left a trail of hostility from the coast, besides a record for both Scotch and rye whiskey that could barely be surpassed. He wore khaki clothes and a Colt with a 9-inch barrel on his strolls in Sarata, and he published conspicuously in bad Spanish and English, which he ordered translated, his opinion of all Bolivian, Cholo, Aymara, or American. His company had committed unutterable follies from a leather director's chair 7,000 miles away, and he proposed to see those follies carried out to the letter. Sometimes we've wondered why our efforts in South America trade and development have met with such scanty success. He was one of the reasons. Rumors came that he had become hostile to our camp down the river, that they encroached on his privileges or were using men whom he had contracted, though we were miles from his properties or influence. As a matter of fact, the leather chair directors had made a contract for cayapos at a figure below cost to the Bolseros and for an advance payment, and had been swindled. The leather chair directors had merely swindled themselves in what was at best an over-sharp Yankee bargain, and in a country where the law does not run east of the Andes and only primitive justice prevails. In default of either of the latter, he proposed to dictate to anyone who went into the montaña and down the river when and how they might or might not use cayapos offered by Bolseros. But I had, at that time, other things to think of. A pack train of some 50 mules with supplies had come in from La Paz for our camp. Also some 15 Cholo laborers, and a mechanic for the camp, and among them a Jap, a queer, silent, pink-cheeked Jap. He was immaculate in appearance and always dapper. How or why he ever drifted into that part of the world was a mystery. He had a little baggage in a nice little lacquered box which, as was revealed later in the rain-swept stone hut of Tolopampa, contained the secret of his pink cheeks. In that dull dawn he had out a little mirror and a bit of carmine and charcoal with which he was adding beautifying touches. On down the river in camp he always appeared the same, but he was a fine workman and could go teetering along on the ridge-pole of a house as easily as a Lecco could run along the river bank. And this outfit arrived with no money to pay for itself, money that the company should have and had promised to send in. The agent left by the engineer in La Paz had sent no money, and the outfit promptly began eating its head off. The single wire that irregularly kept La Paz in touch with Sorata was down, very likely one of the times when an Aymara had needed some wire in wrapping his iron plowshare fast to the crooked tree trunk or for tying on his roof tree, and I could not reach the agent. Another day and no wire fixed. On the 3rd came the news from the village of Iabaya, some 15 miles away, that the Aymaras had broken loose and there was an Indian uprising. From the valley of Sorata we could see the mountains with tiny fires flickering at night, apparently as signals, and occasionally an Indian driving a string of cattle into hiding along some far-off Andean trail. The householders in Sorata began storing water in ollas in their patios, and rifles and cartridges tripled in price. And still there was no wire to La Paz by which either I or the Intendente, who wanted soldiers, could get a message through from Sorata. The men were boarded out, and money was absolutely essential to keep their rations going and to pay any more bills that might come in with more pack trains. Once let the slightest suspicion get the air that there was no money at hand, and the workmen would have fled like quail, and it would have been a matter of the utmost difficulty to secure them or any others again. It meant a very serious emergency for the camp. What had happened in La Paz I did not know, but it became imperative to find out, Aymara outbreak or not. The only man available to go with me, Skeffington, was a great tall man, proportionally built, and a splendid fellow, whose weight would be a handicap in a horse in any emergency. So I decided to go alone. I started at dawn on a little, tough mountain-bred horse and had passed the divide early in the afternoon. At Huaylata I stopped for breakfast, a tin of salmon and some cakes of Aymara bread, a little outside the sprawling collection of mud huts, and an Indian woman came out and sold me a sheaf of barley for the horse. There were no signs of Indian trouble here. The horse ate and then drank, and as he finished drinking he threw up his head and the blood trickled in a heavy stream from his nostrils and he trembled. If the horse was frightened, he was not more so than I. To be horseless and on foot in an Indian plain, and with the uncertain rumors of Aymara outbreaks that might have spread like a flame among that dull, hostile population, was the most unpleasant situation I have ever faced. The little Indian towns where I expected to camp, Copencara and the Tambo of Calcutta, were safe enough, but the thought of getting even to Achicachi, where I might be able to get a fresh horse, gave me 5 minutes of cold and clammy quivers of panic at the pit of my stomach. The horse stood with the blood dripping in a steady patter on the cold ground, while a puddle slowly grew into a great red blot. He looked at me with what, to my understanding, appeared to be his final vision from dulling eyes. The straggling population of the scattering huts of Whylata seemed to have become raised to the final power of sinister hostility. There was no doubt that I was frightened. I took a box of cartridges from my saddlebags and distributed them in my pockets so their weight bore evenly, and waited. There was nothing else to do. There was no use in starting on foot till the horse was surely dead. Presently the horse went back to the spring, took a little drink, and then turned to the cebada and began nibbling. I felt better, for no seriously deranged animal would eat in its final moments. The trickling of blood grew less, and the animal showed in better shape. If he could only last to Achicachi, that was all that I wanted. I did not think it wise to start on foot and leading the horse. That would advertise the fact that I was crippled, while I could wait in Whylata without betraying anything more than a sluggish and lazy disposition. I tried mounting at last, and the horse grunted and then started slowly. How I nursed him those miles! Out of sight of Whylata I walked. The bleeding had stopped, but he seemed weak. I took his temperature with my hand, I petted him, I gave him a bite of chocolate, and when any Aymara huts or little parties hove in sight, I mounted and rode by. Steadily the horse improved, and at times responded to a test trot without difficulty, so that I rode through Achicachi without stopping. Only once had I had the sign of trouble, and that was a little group of Aymaras near the beginning of an old Inca causeway that cuts across one arm of Lake Titicaca. They were drunk, and I could hear snatches of their thin, wailing songs while they were still dots in the distance. As I rode by, they were at one side of the trail where an old mud building held forth as a chicharia, and struggling in that aimless drunken fashion that seems so common to all topers, and that divides all wassailing bands into those prudent souls who are already drunk enough and know it, and those who won't go home until morning or till daylight, or the day after doth appear. They started for me uncertainly, one reaching for a stone, but an Aymara rushed out of the house and knocked it from his hand. Some of the more sober came, too, and again the wrangling started, apparently as to whether they should rush me or not. And in the meantime, I had ridden out of reach. There was nothing to fear in that incident, at least so far as my immediate safety had been concerned. But the critical point lay in avoiding trouble. No one Indian or similar group would have had a chance, unarmed as they were, against any man with a gun, but in a peculiarly abrupt Indian fashion, the countryside is aroused and trouble is apt to close in on the trail ahead in a particularly congested and fatal manner. I had planned to camp in Copencara, but the delay left me plodding along in the cold darkness, and I was glad when I reached Quarina. In the blackness I rode into a pack train of sleepy llamas before they knew it, or I either for that matter, and on the instant I could hear the patter and the thud of their padded feet as they scattered in a panic-stricken flight, while from out of the night came the hissing herd calls of the Aymara drivers trying to hold them together. Off from the highway that led through the town and from somewhere beyond the walled streets, there came the dull beating of many Aymara drums and the mournful tootling of their flutes. Now and again there was the bang of a dynamite cartridge and the pop of firecrackers. An Aymara flitted by in the streets, and I called to him for the way to the house of the corregidor, the chief official. All I could get of his reply was the respectful "ta-ta" as he disappeared. There was not a light that gleamed through a chink in any window or door. The wretched streets were deserted, and only the noises of the fiesta and the occasional glow from a big bonfire down some alley showed where the only signs of life existed. It was possible that the corregidor was barricaded in his house, as, in the very recent affair at Iabaya, I had no mind to intrude on any collection of Aymaras beating tom-toms and raising drunken memories of their abused ancestors. It looked ominous. Presently another dim figure pattered through the darkness, and again I asked for the way to the corregidor. The Aymara gave explanations that I could not have followed in daylight, and then started off to lead the way, straight down an alley to the plaza where were the bonfires and the drums and the dancing and the explosions. Along one side we skirted until the farther side was reached. It was a big plaza, almost as big as the town, and it was filled with Aymaras from miles around. A mass of shifting groups shuffled in their trotting dance around the fires, and hundreds of unattached guests wandered drunkenly about or lay stupefied as they fell, with their faithful wife or wives taking care of the bottle of alcohol till they should revive afresh and athirst. At one end of this plaza my guide stopped. He was a tattered, ragged Aymara, a pongo, a carrier of water and of the lowest caste, and left me at the headquarters of the corregidor, to whom I had the customary right of the country to appeal for shelter. When there is no corregidor, you go to the padre. He was a cholo, a heavy, thick-set man with a strong face, dressed in the ordinary clothes of a white man, whose peculiar dull complexion alone marked him as a cholo. A couple of tattered police lounged in the doorway, and a half-dozen cholos were idling around this headquarters. A Winchester leaned against the corregidor's chair. Some of the others carried theirs as they shuffled about, and back in the dimness of the room could be seen extra carbines leaning against the walls, and from every belt there was the bulge under the coat that indicated a revolver. The corregidor looked at me curiously. A lone traveler at night on the high plateaus in these uncertain times, and speaking bad Spanish, was something of a novelty. One of the ragged policemen took me in charge, and once again I was back in the dark alleys. Before a door in a long wall we stopped, and then a rusty key squeaked, and both horse and I walked through into the walled patio around whose sides opened the windowless rooms. The policeman brought in a bundle of cebada for my horse, and a bowl of native Bolivian soup stew, stinging with ají and grateful in its warmth. For the food and forage I paid, but for the house and shelter the corregidor would accept nothing. There was no bed, nor did I need any, with my saddle and blankets. After the door had been barricaded with a log used for the purpose, I was asleep at once to the lulling of drums and flutes and banging dynamite. End of chapter 19.